what does this free lunch really cost? Erik Wiese will share with us the true cost of what all these free lunches actually cost. It's a manual speech, 12 to 15 minutes. Pay attention is the name of the speech. Please welcome up Mr. Wiese. Pay attention.
Pay attention.
I was somewhat amazed, I have to tell you, when President Obama won re-election in the depth of the worst recession that this country has seen since the Great Depression. And I couldn't believe that a man as gifted as Romney had lost when the guy had mismanaged the economy so poorly. And so I looked on the TV to see what some of the exit polls said. And I remember hearing this woman leave the exit poll and say, "I'm going to vote for Obama because he's going to give me a car. He's just started, and by the time he's done, I'm going to have a new car." I've got some cars here for you guys. This is a Honda Accord XL. It has a base price of about $31,000. It has a navigation system, an 8-inch touchscreen, and a rear view mirror. Let me pass this one around. Here's one I particularly like. It's a Ford Fusion Titanium. Base model around $31,000. 18-inch alloy wheels, proximity key, remote starter, leather, and heated front seats. Here is a Buick Verano Premium, also about $30,000, with IntelliLink, infotainment system, dual zone automatic climate control. And finally, an Acura ILX. I wanted something that would appeal to each and every one of you in this room. This has a base model of about $30,000, and it has a text message reader and Acura's navigation system with restaurant reviews, traffic updates, and weather alerts. Amazing modern technology. Now, what do all of these cars have in common? They're all about $30,000. And does anybody remember what the deficit was when President Bush left office?
$8 billion.
Pretty close. It was about
8 trillion. So.
10 trillion. 10 trillion.
What's a couple of trillion doing?
Does anybody know what the deficit is now?
18?
It's just breached $20 trillion. In the 7 years that President Obama has been mismanaging our country, he has added $10 trillion to the deficit. Do you know what each $1 trillion in this country divided by the number of people in this country equals?
$3,000.
There's 335 million people. So Mr. Decker's absolutely right. Every $1 trillion is $3,000 for each and every one of us. $3,000 for you, me, our children. And if he's misspent $10 trillion, that's $30,000.
Oh, now it's coming together.
There is your car, gentlemen. That's the car he promised you. Do you have it in your driveway right now? Are you driving it around and enjoying it? No. Why not? That's what he has spent on each and every one of ours behalf. We not only not have the car, we have the debt. We have the debt that goes with the car without the car. He's essentially taken that car of your dreams and driven it into a sea of red ink and destroyed it. And there is no insurance to pay for it. You are stuck with the debt without the asset. That's the exact equivalent of what $10 trillion in deficit spending means to you and me and our children. Every single person in our household has a car just like that that's been driven into a sea of red ink. Now you might say, and I know because I've heard it, well, Bush did it first. He's the one who's mostly responsible for starting the spigot going. I've heard it. It's like the little child who says, I don't want to eat my peas. He doesn't have to eat his peas. I shouldn't have to eat my peas. In all fairness, President Bush did increase the deficit. He increased it by half as much as President Obama. He increased it by $4.899 trillion. He did start the spigot flowing. And he doubled the deficit during the time he was in office. So all the people before George Bush spent about $5 trillion. George Bush spent $5 trillion, and Obama has spent $10 trillion, more than every other president before him combined. Those are the numbers. Now you might say, but he saved my job. He saved us from the worst depression ever. Does anybody know how we might be able to measure something like that? How would we measure if the money he spent was actually spent in an efficient, competent way? Wouldn't it show up in some statistic somewhere? Perhaps like the gross domestic product? Wouldn't our gross domestic product show if the money was spent efficiently? If I go and I invest money in a college education, 4 years from now, assuming I don't have one now, I should be able to graduate and get an average of $23,000 more per year the rest of my life. That's what the statistics show is the benefit of getting a college education. So if you make this huge investment, like President Bush and like President Obama have done, it should show up in income. It should show up in the gross domestic product. So if you divide the deficit by the gross domestic product, you should have a very good statistic for how well that money has been spent. Was it invested wisely with a much bigger return, or was it invested poorly? Now I have a graph that I brought with me and that I will pass around. And it shows the U.S. federal debt as a percentage of the gross domestic product. And it's color-coded. It's color-coded with blue being Democrat and red being Republican. So it's very easy to see, and you'll get a close-up view of this in a second, of the differences between the Bush 8 years and the Obama 8 years. And what has happened here is during the start of President Bush's presidency, he inherited about a 54% level of U.S. federal debt as a percent of gross domestic product. During his 8 years in office, even though he spent about $4.8 trillion, that number went up from 54 to 66%, about a 12% increase. Nothing to brag about, but let's not forget, he was a wartime president. The money he spent actually won the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. I know this is the case because he was criticized all the time for trading blood for oil. You guys remember that? The Democrats were always saying, you're trading blood for oil, you're trading blood for oil, you're killing all of our citizens in order to get oil. At least we had the oil at the end of his time. I'll take that criticism. I'll embrace it. Yes, we had the oil. Who has the oil now? ISIS has the oil. In the last 8 years, he's disregarded all of his generals who said, stay there, keep people there. He's left. And who has the oil now? ISIS. And now we're bombing the same oil fields we used to have to prevent ISIS from funding more Paris massacres. So you can't say he spent that money wisely. But what did President Obama do when he inherited this 66% level? He has increased it from 66 to 103%. That's a differential of 37 points. So President Bush increased it 12 points. Obama increased it 37 points. Even though he spent twice as much money, he did it so inefficiently and so incompetently that this ratio is actually a 3-to-1 ratio. Attached is the graph that I make reference to in my presentation. This graph comes from www.usgovernmentrevenue.com, and it shows the U.S. federal debt as a percentage of the gross domestic product by president from 1940 to 2014. If you look on the far left-hand side of the graph, you'll see what I was talking about. President Bush rose that percentage of the debt versus the gross domestic product from 54% to 66%. President Obama rose it from 66% to 103%. So that's a 37% increase versus a 12% increase. He did 3 times as much damage for double the amount of money. On the right-hand side, you'll see $4.9 trillion in debt is what President Bush inherited. He left office with $10.6 trillion, spending over $5 trillion. President Obama has added over $10 trillion to increase the debt from 10.6 to 21 trillion. So he spent over twice as much money as President Bush, but did 3 times as much damage, leaving the total deficit, the total accumulated debt in this country equal to $69,704 per person. Not per household, not per wage earner, per person. Every man, woman, and child in America now owes $69,704 per person, and roughly 30,000 of that was put onto our accumulated debt during the 8 years that President Obama was in office. That is a car that he paid for, drove off a bridge, completely destroyed, leaving us with the debt. Debt we haven't even begun to pay off yet, with no asset to show for it. Thanks, President Obama. So it wasn't invested anywhere near as well as President Bush did. I don't know why that's a surprise, but for the Obama people it is. What are some reasons that could possibly explain this differential? And I'll go ahead and pass this around right now. Well, we already talked about the blood for oil. President Bush knows how to fight a war. Do you remember he told Saddam Hussein that he'd have to leave the country or he was going to get bombed? When did we actually launch the bombs? Did we launch it at the deadline? No, we got actionable intelligence that we knew where his headquarters was. So we launched the attack, a decapitation attack, 24 hours early. We tried to catch him in his bunker and kill him before he could organize a defense. Contrast that to what President Obama did. When he broadcast to the Taliban, there's a lot of liberals who don't like this war, so I promise you all we're going to be out of Afghanistan and Iraq within the next 18 months. And our enemies knew exactly what our plans were. And all they had to do was outweigh us. Perfect example of the difference about how we wage war under a Democrat versus a Republican. Let's look at another. No Child Left Behind. President Bush took federal tax dollars and decided he was going to give a bonus to our teachers, but only if they had accountability, if they had standardized tests to say, how good are your students at the beginning of the school year and how good are they at the end? And those that perform and do their job and it's measurable, they're going to get a bonus. They're going to get a reward. And it's money that was extra, that wasn't in their budget, that was coming from the federal government, because prior to that, all the money came from local school districts. What did President Obama do in order to pacify the teachers' unions in the last 4 or 5 years? He gutted the accountability provisions. He said, there's too many teachers who don't like the loss of self-esteem that comes from not teaching well. That's not good for them. They might want to quit. Well, they don't have to quit. They can't be fired because they're part of the teachers' union. But I want their votes. So when we're in their votes, we're going to gut it. We're going to take all this money that used to have accountability, we're going to still give it as block grants to the states and allow them to do whatever they want, but they don't have to have any accountability for how the schools are doing. Does anybody remember GM? I remember GM. GM used to be a private company that wasn't owned by the unions. I knew a guy who had $1 million in GM stock. There used to be a saying that when GM catches a cold, the entire country, well, when GM gets sniffles, the entire country catches a cold. GM went bankrupt, along with a number of other firms in this country, and it was bailed out. The stock went down to zero. The guy that I knew who had $1 million in stock, he lost it all. And now the unions own it. And do any of you go out and buy GM cars right now? Because I've looked at the reliability under Consumer Reports, and I only buy Japanese now. Solyndra. Does anyone remember Solyndra? That's a local company. They got a $78 million loan in order to do solar panels. They're bankrupt. They went out of business. When the government wasn't continually giving more and more and more and more subsidies, they couldn't make it. They went out of business. Keystone Pipeline. That's, people have estimated that would bring several 100,000 jobs to the United States, be worth $3.1 billion. Obama doesn't want it because there's people that vote for him that don't want it. So he hasn't done that. What about the huge subsidies for car engines? Do you guys remember in the depth of the recession, they didn't like the gas guzzlers, they didn't like the ones that produced the toxic flames or their toxic emissions. So they said, bring your cars in, and as long as we spike the engines and actually destroy the engines and make them unusable, we'll give you a new subsidy to go buy another car. I've actually talked to car dismantlers, and their business went down dramatically because they didn't have any engines. They kept engines from the old cars. They'd buy those old cars and then they'd resell them 2 or 3 or 4 years down the line to somebody who needed a new engine. Their business suffered massively, in addition to the federal taxpayer having to pay a bunch of money for that program. There's also subsidies for solar. There's subsidies for water towers. There's subsidies for everything except nuclear. We're shutting down the cleanest fuel that we have, which is nuclear power plants. The cleanest. Because we're suing them. We're making it, and we're not opening up places where they can go and dispose of the nuclear fuel rods. Nevada has too much power. They have a whole mountain with nothing underneath it that would be a great place to take all of our radioactive waste and throw it down a huge mine shaft, the Yucatan Mountain. And for the last 20 years, everyone has tried to get there, and they haven't been able to overcome all the red tape to make it happen. It's just another example of incompetence in action. Cap and trade. Is our energy cost high enough that we now have to penalize energy companies unless they go and buy credits from other people that don't have anything to do except sell credits? It's a big shell game, and the people who get rich are Goldman Sachs, who manipulates and sells all of the cap and share trades, and people like Al Gore, who goes and has his own private jet and has a massive pool and has a 20,000 square foot house because he gets a portion of the cap and trade benefits that he put in place and manages. But then he goes and buys a little rainforest somewhere so that he can qualify for all of the gas-guzzling privileges that is part of his lifestyle. And then finally, Obamacare. 16% of our economy has just been nationalized in the last 8 years. And what is happening to those insurance companies? They're not allowed to make a profit anymore, so they're not going to compete. A lot of them aren't even competing, they're just going out of business. These are all instances of why, when you spend twice as much money, or twice as much money, President Obama spent twice as much money as President Bush, but the percentage that went up was 3 times as much in terms of debt per gross national product. This is a perfect example of hebetude in action. Now, what is the actual solution for some of the Democrats? Well, the Democrat that just won, that's over in New Hampshire right now, thinks we need more socialism. That's the answer. More freebies. He doesn't seem to understand that we're already out of money, that our debt is already so high, we're having a hard time servicing it. Right now we have the lowest interest rates we've ever had. What happens when those interest rates go up? Right now, 6% of our budget, of our national budget, goes towards interest rates. So that basically is at less than 1%. Federal government has a huge break. They're paying hardly anything to borrow money. What happens when that interest rate goes up? All of a sudden, this little pie chart goes from 6% to 12%. And then, where are you going to cut? You're going to cut from defense. You can't cut from Social Security. You lose all the votes. You can't cut from health care. People are addicted to free health care. So it's going to come out of defense. Or it's going to become out of inflation, or it's going to probably be a lot more in taxes. So when you look around at those $30,000 cars, remember, that's an asset that got paid for by our current president, an asset that we don't have. But the debt is still with us, and we haven't even begun to start making payments. That's each and every one of us, and if we have children at home, that's each and every one of our children. Why do we get into this mess? Because there's too many people who feel that economics is abstruse. They haven't actually studied laws of supply and demand. And so what's the result? The result is that people are angry, and they have a right to be angry. I've just talked to you about all the mismanagement, incompetence that's going on. We have a right to be angry. And what's the big, primary, major reason that some of us are angry? Well, some of us are paying attention. Mr. Toastmaster.